well, good morning. I think that this is a good opportunity to overcome like microphone fright and spotlight fright. So, well, welcome to the third day of this wonderful event. And it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce one of the co-organizers of this conference, Robert Westerfelhaus. I was tempted to pronounce it in a more sort of German way, but no. So Robert teaches at the Department of Communication at the College of Charleston in the US, and he has been a Fulbright visiting professor at the Maria Curie-Sklodowska in 2009. His work and research spans critical theory and communication theory and combines a range of theoretical approaches to American popular culture. And he has published widely in the fields of communication, media, and in relation to the question of identity. Today he will be talking to us about illustrators, mass media, and the rise and demise of America's middle class, middlebrow culture. So please join me to welcome Robert.
I thank you very much for that gracious introduction, and I thank you all as well for showing up on the morning of the third day of our conference, especially after the big and wonderful meal that we had yesterday, which I'm sure made some of you, like myself, a little lethargic. It took a while to digest all of that good food and intellectual conversation. So I'll go ahead and begin my presentation at this point. Much of my work as a communication studies scholar who uses rhetoric and semiotics focuses upon popular culture, popular American culture, comic books, films, television, video games, etc. The scope of popular culture also includes the work of such illustrators as N.C. Wyeth and Maxfield Parrish. Taking a scholarly interest in such things has only recently been legitimized within the academic world and is still quite frankly a subject of hot dispute in some quarters. In defense of such studies, I will have to say that popular culture both reflects and influences the society in which we live economically, politically, religiously, and in many other ways. So if you want to understand where we have come from and where we are going, a study of popular culture can be very helpful in that respect. I do want to note at the outset that in discussing any artists, I render no aesthetic judgments, but instead am making cultural observations. I also don't want you to come away from this talk thinking that I am defending or celebrating a middlebrow culture, although I must confess to a certain sentimental attachment to that culture, having grown up in it. I hadn't intended to have this as part of the presentation, but I will share with you that I grew up as a military brat. My father was a sergeant in the Air Force, and so I spent much of my time as a child moving from place to place, living on Air Force bases, in cities and regions as culturally and geographically diverse as Omaha, Nebraska, and Okinawa, Japan. During that time, I had not seen an art museum, for example. I didn't know that people actually own books because books weigh a lot of pounds and the military is not going to pay to move that. So the first time I ever saw a museum in real life was as a senior in high school when my father was stationed at Grissom Air Force Base in Indiana, and we went down to Indianapolis. My brother and father wanted to see the Indianapolis Speedway Museum, and I wanted to see the Art Museum, and they were kind enough to indulge me in that. And that was the first time I had seen paintings in real life and understood that you could really see brushstrokes, that paint had dimension. I was absolutely shocked and amazed, so that I could see that Caravaggio, for example, and Turner, that they are not only different in terms of how they, the imagery and the way they render it, but that the technique itself was radically different as well. So that was an eye-opening experience for me. The notion of culture as an intellectual concern, culture of any kind, as a theoretical concept, is a relatively recent idea in the intellectual history of the human race. As defined by E.B. Taylor, the founder of cultural anthropology, culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, beliefs, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. More succinctly defined, culture is affective, cognitive, behavioral, and material in its dimensions. It is vitally connected to the economic, political, and social realms of our collective lived experience, it draws from and informs them, while simultaneously being both a part of and apart from them. In the West, we don't find Aristotle or Plato or Socrates discussing culture qua culture, and we don't find those kinds of discussions taking place in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. Although the thinkers of those ages all talk about aspects of shared social life that today we would refer to as cultural elements. The same is true if you would look at other cultures. Confucius and Mencius, for example, do not discuss culture qua culture. Indeed, one would be hard-pressed to find any mention of culture as we understand it in any intellectual tradition of any society prior to the 19th century. Two movements of that century led to our current understanding of culture, one aesthetic and one social scientific. Got to put that one on. So let's talk a little bit about the two, there we go, now I'm right where I need to be. The aesthetic movement that informs our discussion of culture in the West is the Romantic movement, which was an artistic, literary, and musical response to and reaction against the Enlightenment's emphasis upon reason and scientific analysis at the expense, perceived or actual, of the imagination and emotions. Romanticism, especially as expressed in England and Germany, was intensely interested in beliefs and practices associated with a reimagined and distant past, or with exotic others found within or outside their nations. Romanticized tales of Robin Hood and King Arthur are example of the former. The stories included in oral traditions collected by anthropologists abroad or by such folklorists as the Brothers Grimm in Germany or Andrew Lang in Britain are examples of the latter. Folklore, the stories told and retold by common folk, was viewed by Romantic artists, authors, and composers as an important repository of cultural heritage worth mining. We find that, for example, in the stories of Brer Rabbit that were collected by Harris amongst the Geechee in Georgia. We find that in the stories that were collected by Bennett from the Gullah in Charleston area. Looking at Charleston itself, we saw a brief picture of it. You have a folk story, a legend about Porgy that eventually became a cheesy novel that was then turned into a magnificent opera by Gershwin. So you can see that there can be a lot of cultural commerce between different aspects of culture. The same is true in music. The classical composer and the Romantic traditions, such as Bartók or Dvorak, could and would make extensive use of folk music motifs. In addition to the Romantic movement, we also have the social sciences as we understand them today emerging as a product of the 19th century. Relevant to our interest in culture are anthropology and sociology. The former, traditionally interested in foreign and primitive cultures, primitive, of course, in quotation marks, the latter in social arrangements of so-called advanced societies, especially those of the West. Anthropologists and sociologists also collected folk tales, folk art, and folk music, but with the goal of using them as data to analyze rather than as sources of inspiration to use creatively or merely as a means of entertainment. We have, for example, Alan Rudolph, a folklorist who traveled throughout Arkansas collecting tales and jokes of the Ozark peoples. He did it not because he wanted to entertain people. He did it not because he wanted to be inspired in his creative work. He did it in order to collect data to understand the people living in the Ozarks. In some respect, treating these folk art products as mere artifacts rather than as creative works worthy of appreciation is a reflection of a kind of elitist snobbery. So too is a distinction that was drawn in the 1800s by Matthew Arnold, who created the conception of what he refers to as high culture in a book, Culture and Anarchy, 1869. Oftentimes this is referred to as highbrow culture. In the preface to that work, Arnold defines high culture as, quote, the disinterested endeavor after man's perfection, unquote. He later goes on to say, where am I at? There we go. He later goes on to say that those who have cultivated an acquaintance with high culture know the best that has been said and thought in the world. That is indeed quite a claim. When we think in terms of high culture, Immediately, such things as Shakespeare and Beethoven come to our mind, writers such as Dostoevsky. You probably have a long laundry list of people that use works you would place in the category of high culture. Of course, if there is high culture, there is also low culture as well. Logic would dictate that such a thing if you follow the dictates of binary logic. And so we must have low culture as a complementary opposite. And one does indeed find the term used and used quite frequently: low culture, low-brow culture. If high culture encompasses the best that a society has to offer, then low culture must by definition include, if not the worst, certainly elements of questionable worth. I think you might see some elements of questionable worth in the slide that's being displayed here. We have Las Vegas, which is an exuberant celebration of American kitsch culture. I have to confess that I got married in Las Vegas doing the typical Vegas thing. I won't bore you with that tale, but if you want to hear about it, it was quite interesting. Among other things, my wife, who is very frugal, insisted that we go to the commissioner of marriage. So there was a guy with cowboy boots, a bolo tie, and a big belt buckle, myself, my wife, no one else in the room. And you know that you need to have a marriage license to get married, but the marriage certificate is proof that that happened. They married us a marriage certificate with the signatures of two people who were not witnesses. I think I have plausible deniability in that respect. We have, of course, McDonald's as an example of low culture cuisine as opposed to what one would associate with high culture cuisine. And do any of you recognize the show that's being depicted on the lower right-hand corner? The Jerry Springer Show. That's sad that even people outside the United States recognize this. A couple of interesting facts. I was talking to some of Edyta Frelik's and Derrick Kutnik's classes earlier this week, and they also were familiar with the Jerry Springer Show. Statistically, whenever that show has been introduced into a new nation, emigration from that nation to the United States takes a sudden spike down. That could be a coincidence, but if those people who are really worried about border integrity were to just put a bunch of a phalanx of television stations with the Springer Show along the border to the south, they will not be coming here. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Springer himself. He was at one point the city manager of Cincinnati, the equivalent of being mayor, and he ran for governor, and this is something that my friends do not know, and I hope that it will not ruin my friendship with him. When he ran for governor, I voted for Jerry Springer. He is really a very smart and articulate politician, although not as smart as he should have been. He lost his mayoral position in Cincinnati because he patronized houses of ill repute across the river in Kentucky and used checks to pay for the services. So when they raided them, there was a number of checks with the signature of the mayor of Cincinnati on it. Now, as you can imagine, the boundaries between high culture and low culture and what we'll eventually define as middle culture are permeable. You know, if a composer is borrowing from folk music, then that composer is familiar with folk music, can't do it otherwise, and appreciative of folk music. And much the same way in the United States today, you have rap artists that borrow from classical music and musicals and a whole host of musical genres that one would not necessarily associate with urban African Americans listening to, and yet they are familiar with and responsive to and making creative use of these. So the boundaries are permeable. Also, I want to note that no single individual is mired in one of the cultures that we're talking about. You can read a Shakespeare book and appreciate it, and watch Jerry Springer too and appreciate that as well. You could eat McDonald's and you could eat high cuisine. In fact, most of those of us who live in contemporary complex societies navigate quite frequently between the various forms of culture and do so without even paying much attention to it or apologizing for it. This is, of course, a simplistic sketch, but one that is recognizable to and resonates with most people who draw a distinction between attending a classical concert or viewing Jerry Springer. To be fair, the 20th century has seen an aesthetic reappraisal of genres too, and the works that they include, genres and works that have been derisively dismissed in the past by educated elites, such as bluegrass, Delta blues or Zydeco in music, or the hard-boiled detective story in science fiction, the best of in literature, or film noir in movies. These have all at one point were considered aspects of low culture that are now considered aspects of high culture. You could buy Raymond Chandler by, what is it, the Scribner's literature, something or other. So our culture is not composed of polar opposites. There are degrees on the continuum between high and low culture. And so-called middle-brow culture occupies a substantial space between these two poles. In preparing for this talk, I look up the term on the ever-reliable Wikipedia website. I always do that. I'm just curious to see what they have to say. And Wikipedia defined middle-brow culture as, quote, both a certain type of easily accessible art, often literature, as well as, more negatively, the population that uses art to acquire culture and class that is usually unobtainable, unquote. That seems to be a scathing indictment of middle culture. At this point, I would like to provide my own, and I hope more nuanced definition of middle-brow culture, and then I will go on to discuss its origins, chart its history, and explain its relevance to the subject of this conference in general, and American illustrators in particular. Middle-brow culture. Middle-brow culture is aspirational, it's democratic, it is accessible, and it is disparaged by key arbiters of high culture. These are the four defining features of middle-brow culture. Let's move on to the notion of middle-brow culture as aspirational. This is in keeping with the general American impulse to improve oneself, for which we find literary evidence as far back as Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, and even further in the past if one considers volitional emigration as a means of self-improvement. To improve oneself intellectually through education, materially through improved income, spiritually through any of the various means and practices, and in recent years especially physically through diet and exercise. These are American pursuits, these are American interests that reflect a kind of optimism about the ability that we have as individuals to recreate, reinvent, renew ourselves. Many middle-class Americans have operated from the optimistic, some would say naive belief that the means of improvement should be and could be convenient and efficient, and they can be purchased as part of the consumer culture. And, very important to Americans, the means of improvement itself can and should be measurable. A classic example of this middle-brow approach to aspirational improvement is offered by the Harvard Classics, first published in 1909. According to Harvard University President Charles W. Eliot, a good liberal arts education could be obtained by an average person reading serious works of literature, history, philosophy, and science for only 15 minutes a day. These works, he said, could be included in a collection of books that would fit on a 5-foot shelf. So as you note that there's both temporal and spatial measurement here. 5 feet, 15 minutes a day, efficiency and ease, you could have the same level of educational attainment as someone attending Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Brown. No need for time-consuming classes at an expensive university. And there's, of course, a great deal. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm saying this is the suggested. Some people are looking at me with great skepticism here. But the same impulse continues on. A few decades later, just after World War II, a similar democratized approach to acquiring a liberal arts education was promoted by University of Chicago Chancellor Robert Maynard Hutchins and Mortimer Adler in the form of the Great Books Collection and the local groups that were formed to discuss them. Participation in these groups did not require special education, a college degree. It did require some literacy, of course, but there weren't a lot of requirements. The notion was that average people could come together and discuss above average books and understand them and make sense of them individually and collectively. So, in addition to being an aspirational, middle-brow culture is also democratic rather than elitist. Even though it admires, often from a distance, the literature, music, etc., associated with high culture, these offer aspirational goals toward which individuals and groups aspire to achieve, to understand, to participate in, to consume, etc. Another example of this, for those of you who are either almost as old as I am or have read about it in history, Leonard Bernstein, or Bernstein, depending upon how you'd like to pronounce his name. I've heard it both ways, as they say in psych. In the 1950s, he had a televised lecture series on CBS Arts called Omnibus, in which he introduced the American television viewing public to works of classical music and explained them to the audience in such a way that they were supposed to be able to understand and appreciate them. Of course, chances are quite good that in most homes, after initial enthusiasm from their purchase, the Harvard classics and the great book collections gather dust on shelves as neglected intellectual status symbols rather than being regularly used as an integrated part of an individual's or a family's life. Middle-class culture is accessible. accessible. The books it celebrates, the art and music it truly appreciates, do not require an acquired taste that is the product of a refined upbringing and an education reserved for and available to only the very few. Think, for example, the short stories of James Thurber, the historical novels of James Michener, the light classical music of the Cincinnati or Boston Pops orchestras, and the paintings of Norman Rockwell with their sentimental portrayals of idealized American life. Finally, as I am defining it, middle culture is disparaged by the arbiters of high culture. Does anybody recognize the photograph of the gentleman on the upper left? Yes, Dr. Kutnik. That would be whom? Cheater. It's Vladimir Nabokov, the author of Lolita. In an unflattering passage in that novel, Nabokov writes about the Philistine, his definition of an American Philistine. Quote, "The Philistine does not care much for pictures, but for the sake of prestige, he may hang in his parlor reproductions of Van Gogh or Whistler's respective mothers, although secretly preferring Norman Rockwell," unquote. In another of his books, Panin, he unfavorably compares Salvador Dali to Norman Rockwell. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book or that comparison. He says that both artists are actually consummate technicians who use their artistic abilities in the service of the banal. So for Dali, it is surrealistic sexuality. For Rockwell, it is an idealized and romanticized and saccharine version of the American scene. Thus, Nabokov, who's not particularly. Well, why would, according to Nabokov, why would Americans secretly prefer Rockwell? Because, as David Camp explains in an article published in Vanity Fair, many art critics of the kind whose opinions matter routinely dismiss Rockwell's paintings as, quote, ghastly specimens of sentimental kitsch, unquote. I'll have more to say about neglect of and criticism toward middlebrow illustrators later. But the middlebrow culture that I've just defined, I would like now to explain how it came about, the American version of it, how it was made possible by the intersection of cultural, economic, social, and technological trends that began in the 19th century and were carried on into the 20th. Several of these trends contributed to the creation of a middle class possessing the education, leisure, and financial resources required to cultivate themselves culturally, in emulation of the upper classes whom they admired and to which they aspired. Also important was the development of mass culture that was made possible first by the printing press and then on a grander scale by the Industrial Revolution. At the beginning of the new millennia, this current millennia, the cable television network A&E counted down the 100 most influential people of the past millennium. Americans like to rank and list things. If you go on to any, every time my wife has the internet open, it's like the 10 top most whatever, movies, books, films, food, restaurants, hotels, etc. We like doing that apparently. The network rightly determined, in my view, that Johannes Gutenberg was the most influential human being of the last 1,000 years. Gutenberg's invention in the mid-15th century of a printing press based upon movable type revolutionized the world by making the first genuinely mass culture permissible through the creation of the first mass medium. As a communication professor, we discuss mass media quite a bit, and it's a term that is used frequently in the press and amongst, colloquially, but most people don't really take the time to reflexively know what mass media is, so I will define it. Mass media, media plural, medium singular, but the mass media are made possible through the material use of some material the sender sends a message to a receiver through some material. It could be as simple as paper and ink on it, or it could be as complicated as electronic waves that make it possible for television and radio, etc. But there's some material means of moving the message from the sender to the receiver to an intended and oftentimes unintended audience. This means that the sender does not have to be physically or present, or even temporally present. Mass media can take place asynchronously. In other words, I can read a book that was written 100 years ago. The author can be dead, but the communication can still take place. Mass media is also broadcast, which is a huge distinction between the mass media and the social media that now permeate our lives. The term broadcast itself is an agricultural term that was used metaphorically. There are different ways of putting seeds in the ground, and farmers, when they broadcast, they just cast seeds out like this. And the idea of the early communication theorists that were looking at the emergent mass media at the beginning of the 20th century, films and radio shows, etc., was sent out to large, undifferentiated audiences. They didn't have marketing, they didn't have demographics, they didn't have focus groups, and all those sorts of things. They were just hoping to attract an audience. We put out a magazine, we hope someone buys it. We shoot a film, we hope someone watches it. That's not the case anymore, but it was the case at the time. The mass dissemination of material that Gutenberg's invention made possible resulted in, among many other things, the Protestant Reformation, Luther's pamphlets, the ability of average people to own their own personal Bibles, the scientific revolution. Books were no longer large, expensive, but rather you could take them out into the field. You could observe what was being described. Is it accurate or not? An increase in literacy. There was no need for widespread literacy when books were rare and expensive. And the development of the modern democratic states through political tracts, newspapers, etc., and so on and so on. The invention of print mass media also introduced new forms of entertainment, such as the novel and serialized magazine stories. They could not have existed in an age when you did not have that mass media form to disseminate them. The mass media made possible by the printing press, books, magazines, newspapers, flyers, etc., were the only form of mass media until the 20th century, which saw a proliferation of mass-mediated means of communication, such as films, radio, television, cassette tapes, records, CDs, videos, DVDs, and other methods of producing and disseminating messages intended for a mass audience. Those in this room inhabit a world that is still saturated by the mass media, and this saturation has changed the way we live and how we view the world we live in. The mass media have fostered the development of truly national, even transnational cultures, often at the expense of regional cultures, and they have helped to create and sustain middlebrow culture. Literature was no longer the purview of those educated few who had access to books, such as monks during the Middle Ages, or those who could afford to purchase their own, such as princes. The same is true of the visual arts. Technological advances rendered mass-produced visual images available to a broad audience. These include the woodcut for books technique invented by Albrecht Pfister of Bamberg, not long after Gutenberg introduced the movable type. The etching process invented by Daniel Hopfer of Augsburg, also a product of the 15th century, was used by Rembrandt and Goya. The lithograph, yet another German invention, introduced in the late 18th century by Sennenfelder, as an inexpensive means of promoting theatrical productions, also made it possible to disseminate widely images. The middle class in America and abroad could not afford to regularly patronize the best painters, sculptors, and other artists, and did not therefore own many, if any, original works of fine art. Nor did they often have the funds needed to travel to Florence, Paris, and Rome to view famous works of art in person. But thanks to mass-produced images, the middle class enjoyed mediated access to the visual arts, both reproductions and original creations. Many, if not most, of the latter were in the form of illustrations accompanying stories in magazines and books. Additional advances in printing techniques in the years following the Civil War resulted in the golden age of American illustration. Initially, illustrators would paint an image that would then be translated by a woodcut engraver. Soon these translations were replaced by line etchings on etched metal plates. Next came halftone engravings capable of reproducing the tonal values of a drawing or painting. Eventually came the four-color process, separation process, which produced illustrations possessing, or more accurately, appearing to possess a full range of colors. These innovations alone, however, do not account for the explosion of printed materials purchased by middle-class consumers. Rotary presses made printing cheaper and faster. The American commitment to universal education created a citizenry with a high literacy rate. These raters drove demand for printed media, especially in an age when there was no television, no film, no radio. They were the primary, in fact, almost sole means of mass communicated entertainment and information. In addition, in an effort to promote public literacy, in 1879, Congress approved postal subsidies for magazines, making it cheap for publishers to mail them to subscribers. The extensive railroad system rendered such delivery far more efficient than had been possible. The inexpensive postal rates, coupled with the efficiency of railroads, extended the reach of once regional publishers, making possible truly national magazines that were read by consumers from coast to coast, such as Harper's and the Atlantic Monthly. This national reach also increased exposure to and the influence of magazine writers and illustrators. The mass media in the form of magazines and then later film, television, etc., encouraged the development of a mass national culture that has endured until only recently. My favorite social scientific law, and I'm sure you all have your own, is the law of unintended consequences from the discipline of economics. One of the unintended consequences of the collectively shared mass culture made possible through technology and fostered by the mass media illustrates just how homogeneous that culture once was. The New York City superflush associated with the final episode of the television series MASH in 1983. This is not an urban legend. I did a lot of diligent fact-checking to make sure that it really did happen, and it did. At the conclusion of the final episode, so many people in the New York metropolitan area relieved themselves and then flushed their toilets that there was a sudden and precipitous drop in the water pressure of the two tunnels that delivered the liquid to New York City from the Catskills. It's actually doubtful that such a phenomenon would happen again, given the practice of DVRing shows and watching them at one's convenience, as well as the proliferation of cable stations and other viewing options such as Amazon, Hulu, and Netflix. There is, however, some smaller flushes for those of you who are interested after the Super Bowl, for example. Everybody kind of wants to watch it, and then, it's a problem for some large municipalities with struggling water conservation concerns. There are, of course, many other claims upon our individual and collective time and attention placed upon us by the social media, the internet, and the demands of fractured professional and personal lives, and other facets of our complicated and cluttered contemporary life that prevent the kind of shared communal experience that we see here in this particular slide. I was sharing with the students at UMCS a personal story. Growing up as a middle-class, blue-collar kid, in an age when there was not a great many options in terms of television viewing. We had 3 major networks, and if you lived in a big city, there were those weird UHF stations. And so when The Wizard of Oz was aired, you had to watch it. You couldn't record it. It wasn't on DVR. It wasn't on a DVD. It wasn't on video. So you either saw it or you didn't. It came once a year. It was a big event. It was a communal event. So I watched it almost every year when I was a kid. It was exciting. And we had a black and white TV. It wasn't until I was an adult visiting friends who were watching The Wizard of Oz that I knew that Oz did not look like it did when I was a kid. I looked over early on and said, that's Oz. I looked over again, and then it was vibrant colors, golds and greens and things like that. And it was quite a shock to me to see Oz in that respect. Middlebrow culture was nurtured within the bosom of this shared mass-mediated culture that is now, frankly, eroding. Wow, that's a real dramatic music, isn't it? I wish. I'll wait till they do that. For 5 decades of the 20th century, almost every week, the Saturday Evening Post arrived in people's homes with covers graced with a painting by illustrator Norman Rockwell. While his work continues to be popular as a legacy of middlebrow culture, Rockwell was and remains no darling of art critics. Indeed, a major retrospective exhibition of his paintings held at the Guggenheim in 2001 set an attendance record, hence an indexical indication of popularity. It also drew the ire of critics. Jerry Saltz of the Village Voice had this to say, quote, "The exhibition shows the Guggenheim further trashing the reputation won for it by generations of artists," unquote. This is in keeping with an observation made by Catherine Fox of the New York Times, who in reporting about the show noted that, quote, "The art cognoscenti dismissed Rockwell for decades, banishing the famous illustrator to the basement of art history," unquote. Almost a decade later, Blake Gopnik of the Washington Post, in commenting upon an exhibition of Rockwell paintings at the Smithsonian, criticized the artist's body of work as an, quote, "unending cliche," unquote. This negative critical response to Rockwell has been consistent over time. As Deborah Solomon writes in her 2013 biography of Rockwell, American Mirror, The Life and Art of Norman Rockwell, quote, "Norman Rockwell was demonized by a generation of critics who not only saw him as an enemy of modern art, but of all art. He was seen as a lowly calendar artist whose work was unrelated to the lofty ambitions of art," unquote. When not generating scathing critical reviews from the cultural elite, Rockwell's work is simply ignored by them. A telling example of this is an oil study he made for his freedom of speech painting. The study was sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1952 for a mere $100. The Met was the first museum to buy one of Rockwell's works, and some of his colleagues at the magazine said that he hooped and hollered when he heard that they had purchased his work. But interestingly, the piece is conspicuously absent from the Met's expanded and reorganized American wing. The museum's website lists the work as, quote, "not on view," unquote. I looked at it just before I left. It's still not on view. It is consistently not on view. They have never displayed that particular work. Now, I ought to tell you, in case that I am not a Norman Rockwell fan. My wife, on the other hand, is. But I am, as I told you, a product of that middlebrow culture. So in 1991, I went to the Ohio State Fair, and they were selling the great books. And in fact, it's the last time they've ever sold them. They never published an edition again. Purchased them. And part of that purchase included a Norman Rockwell volume, and I was just going to give it away or give it to a used bookstore or something. And my wife says, "Oh, no, I love his work. Don't do that." But in discussing Rockwell, I just wanted to make it clear that I am not one of his, I don't dislike him particularly as a person, but I don't particularly like his art. And this is just an aside. We talked about him and Nabokov. At one point, the Rockwells had a dog that they named Lolita. We're prompted to ask why all this derision directed. Is it technique, subject matter, approach, the venues in which Rockwell's illustrations were featured, popular magazines rather than art galleries that are juried, their purpose, not for art's sake, but rather a commercial product to sell magazines and illustrate text, the fact that his paintings are accessible, their consequent popularity? I would argue that it's probably a combination of all these factors and maybe several more. Is Rockwell's case unique as an American illustrator? And if not, what does this mean with respect to the relationship of middlebrow culture to high? Let's concentrate our attention upon accessibility and its relationship to popularity. As some of you probably know, in the early 1990s, 2 Russian emigre artists, Komar and Malamud, commissioned a poll to assess American preferences with respect to paintings. The poll revealed that the overwhelming majority of average Americans liked realistically rendered and thus recognizable subject matter, especially landscapes with lots of blue for skies and water and green for grass and trees. They later went on, incidentally, to do the same poll in many other cultures and places, China, India, etc., with the same result. So it would seem then, additionally, that the people polled preferred landscapes to be populated by people and animals. Such images are inherently accessible and as a result, apparently, very popular. But such imagery is not generally critically acclaimed or institutionally valued, nor has it been for quite some time. To be fair, there are exceptions to this lack of critical acclaim and institutional valuation, and things might be changing. About a decade and a half ago, a show organized by Atlanta's High Museum of Art and the Norman Rockwell Museum traveled the country and was exhibited at such top-tier venues as the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, the San Diego Museum of Art, the Phoenix Art Museum, and the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim was encouraged to book the show by art historian Robert Rosenblum, who in 1998 published a flattering assessment of Rockwell in Art Forum. Of course, this is the same show that drew the ire of Jerry Saltz in The Village Voice. Let's examine the case of another middlebrow American illustrator. Does anybody recognize this artist? Who's that? It looks a lot like his, doesn't it? But it's not. Although, what's that? What's that? You're good because it's someone who influenced both of those. Yes, who said that? You get the award. Because as you know, he was a teacher of N.C. Wyeth, and there's some dispute as to the degree to which he had an influence on Maxfield Parrish when Parrish was at the institution he was at. But yes, Howard Pyle. The fact that an educated and sophisticated crowd of art enthusiasts are unfamiliar with his work is probably an indication of the relationship of middlebrow to highbrow culture. Although, famously, in one of his letters to his brother Theo, Vincent van Gogh admitted that Pyle's illustrations, quote, struck me dumb with admiration. So either Van Gogh is a poor judge of art, or I'm not really sure what to draw of that. What's that? I'm not surprised. In addition to Pyle's own illustrations, which often accompanied his written work, many of which were adventure stories featuring pirates, Arthurian knights, and legendary rogues like Robin Hood, he also exercised direct influence over a generation of illustrators through his role as an educator, first at the Drexel Institute of Art, Science, and Industry, and later at his own Howard Pyle School of Illustration. One of his many prominent students was N.C. Wyeth, so some of you noticed the influence there, as well as other artists associated with the Brandywine School. His illustrations also influenced Hollywood, which in turn influenced how it is that contemporary Americans today understand and view pirates, medieval knights, Robin Hood, etc. What we see in film is not historically accurate, as my colleagues in the history department are always quick to remind me. Charleston itself, the city that I live in, had a lot of pirate history. None of the pirates that you see depicted from contemporary sources look anything like the pirates in Howard Pyle's illustrations, but they look everything like the pirates that you see in Pirates of the Caribbean. In reporting about a small exhibition of Pyle's work that was held in the hallway of the Federal Reserve, I'm assuming that's not a prestigious venue, you actually had to make an appointment to get in and see it. It was a really small hallway, and there were only maybe a half dozen pictures. Richard Paul of the Washington Post noted that scholars dismiss him, and many texts ignore him, quote, many texts ignore him. Most art museums stiff him. The biggest ones in Washington, the Washington Art Museum, the Corcoran, the National Gallery of Art, pay him no attention. He goes on to observe that those who hold their noses when looking at his pictures, and this includes a lot of curators, see Howard Pyle's work as the story-based and middlebrow and therefore unimportant. They don't think Pyle counts. Like many other popular American masters of mass-market reproduction, like Norman Rockwell and Walt Disney, Pyle remains beyond their scope of interest. Why is this the case? I suggest that there are at least two reasons that are relevant to the focus of this study. The first is that of definition. Was Howard Pyle a writer who illustrated, or an illustrator that wrote, or was he equally adept at both? There is perhaps some concern, some suspicion, often justified, that when an artist who excels in one area and then works in another, that artist does so as a dilettante. I can think, and I'm sure you can too, of numerous actors who recorded mediocre music that sold well because of their celebrity. During my lifetime, Eddie Murphy, David Soul, Patrick Swayze, John Travolta, Bruce Willis, the list could go on and on. They are not gifted singers. They are not gifted musicians. Some of them are not even gifted actors, to be honest with you, but the point is that there is justifiable suspicion. Of course, it is possible to be good at something and great at something else. Something you could have a primary creative endeavor that is your thing, and then you could maybe do good. I think, for example, of Joni Mitchell. You know, beautiful music, I think that she's a good artist, but I don't think she's necessarily a great artist. The compositions with which she illustrates her album covers, and now she has at least been doing a lot of painting. They're good, but I don't think that they're great. Another example, Nobel Prize winning author and British politician Winston Churchill, as many of you know, was a painter. I think he painted passably well, but I doubt that anybody in here would place the paintings of Winston Churchill among the finest produced during the 20th century. There are exceptions, of course, to this kind of suspicion. What's that? He was a painter? I did not know that. Was he a good painter? Oh, well, that makes my point. Competent, modestly competent. What's that? It was a hobby. I think it was a release for Churchill too, and it's perfectly fine to have a release like that. In Edyta Frelik's brilliant and award-winning dissertation written under the direction of Dr. Jerzy Kutnik, so I'm paying my homage here, which I was privileged to read as a work in progress, she argues that the writing of some visual artists do deserve to be treated as literature and not just as sources to mine for biographical details and theoretical concerns. Dr. Frelik discusses this need to reevaluate the literary merit of the writings of selected visual artists with respect to 20th century American painters Thomas Hart Benton, Marston Hartley, and Ad Reinhardt. But we can find examples of visual artists who were also accomplished writers in other linguistic traditions and historical contexts. For example, the sonnets of Michelangelo are well regarded as Italian literature. I've also heard good things about his paintings and sculptures as well. Whether Pyle's literary output deserves similar accolades is a debatable issue that happily we do not have to concern ourselves with here, as we are focusing upon him as an illustrator. Which brings me to another reason why I believe his work and the work of others like him is disparaged when not neglected by art critics and museum curators. And that is the middlebrow propensity to mix the visual and the verbal, hence making things accessible, as in the case of illustrated texts of the kind produced by Pyle, which, with few exceptions, are viewed with suspicion by high culture arbiters. There is condescension towards such texts that are illustrated, which is regarded as childish, among other things. During my Fulbright here at UMCS, I taught students some classes in American popular culture, and it absolutely surprised me the extent to which my Polish students denigrated comic books. Now, comic books have changed a great deal over the course of my lifetime. They used to be printed on cheap newsprint, 4-color process, et cetera, with simplistic, moralistic stories. But they've come a long way. One of the books that I had them read was The Dark Knight, not to be confused with the film, mind you. The Dark Knight is just a term that is used for Batman, but The Dark Knight that was created by Frank Miller, it was a reinvention of the Batman as a middle-aged sadistic speed freak and violent vigilante, and there was a great deal of social commentary that was embedded within that particular work. Another text that I assigned to some of the classes here, as well as in the United States, is The Watchmen, written by Alan Moore, drawn by Dave Gibbons, and colored by John Higgins. It originally came out as in 12 separate issues, serially, sequentially, and then it was published as a graphic novel. For those of you who have not read it, it is a remarkable and brilliant deconstruction of the American monomyth, which is what informs American conceptions of superheroes and westerns and sci-fi, etc. It's brilliant. It's in terms of narrative. It's brilliant in terms of its mythic content. It's brilliant in terms of its satire and parody and the many different things that it does. So brilliant, in fact, that in 1988 it won a Hugo Award for other forms. They didn't know what award to give it, so they created a special award just to give it to The Watchmen. But that was highly controversial. There were people who thought there should not have been a special award. There were people who thought that it couldn't compete with books that were pure text. There was a lot of argument that took place as a result of this within the sci-fi community, which tends to be a bit more, I think, tolerant than other genre communities. So it was highly contentious. But now, since 2009, the Hugo Awards has a Best Graphic Story category, a recognition of this. Here's a photograph from The Watchmen. The Watchmen does also a lot of what's called intertextuality. Intertextuality, it draws from a great deal of American popular culture. This is a character that's based on Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver, if you're familiar with that particular Scorsese film. It's a very dark, it's certainly not an age-appropriate comic book for nephews and nieces and things of that nature. At this point, I think it would be good for me to move to my conclusion. I've completely lost track of time. And to speculate as to what's going on with American middlebrow culture now. As you know, the title of my presentation is The Decline and Demise. I think that it is probably, if not in serious decline, it is already demised. And it's demised for several different reasons. One is the declining power of high culture to set the agenda for the arts. As you know, there are those who say there's no canon at all. There are others who say that there's no criteria that could be used for taste. It doesn't matter what people like at all, period, from the junkiest, trashiest romantic novel or movie to the highest form. I don't agree with that particular perspective at all, but if you are a complete relativist when it comes to matters of aesthetic taste, then there's no sense in having an aspirational culture, because what are you aspiring toward? Whatever you like is fine to like. Another thing that is contributing to this is the creation of masses of media, so that you could have niche cable, social media, et cetera, et cetera. We no longer have to have shared communal experiences in order to consume media. We can consume media that speaks directly to us, and we can consume media, therefore, that doesn't necessarily have anything to say about other media, other genres, other tastes, et cetera. When I was growing up, a popular, probably the most popular radio format was Top 40, and Top 40 was denigrated. There was a lot of trashy bubblegum music on Top 40. But driving along the highways, you could hear Johnny Cash, followed by Aretha Franklin, followed by the Beatles. That's an enormous amount of talent in a very short period of time. And wide genres, too, from country to rhythm and blues to rock and roll. That doesn't exist anymore as a result of Sirius and radio stations like that. People just listen to the music they like, and they're never exposed to music that challenges them and forces them to experience and encounter different forms of music. So where is middlebrow culture today? I honestly think that it's a ghost of itself. I don't think that there is really a middlebrow culture today. I think that there are so many different cultures out there at so many different levels, if you even accept the notion that there are these artificial constructs, high and low culture, as defined by Matthew Arnold. There are vestiges of it, of course. In fact, some recent purchases of Norman Rockwell paintings, they sold for more than recent purchases of Andy Warhol paintings. So there are people with a lot of money who have middlebrow tastes and who are willing to commit themselves as consumers to celebrating that particular taste. And I guess with that, I'll go ahead and conclude and invite whatever questions, criticisms, or concerns you might have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Robert. I have, a number of questions, but I think, it would be nice to actually have open the discussion to the participants. So, any questions?
Robert, thank you very much. You and I have something in common in that we're both American professors who have taught here in Poland. And when I taught a class at the University of Łódź, I began by asking my students in a course on American family and immigration in American film what they knew about the United States. And one of your slides made me think about this, and so I wrote some of those things down. Everyone eats McDonald's. Jerry Springer accurately renders American families and relationships. Everyone hates Barack Obama. No one can drive a car with a manual transmission. Everyone has 5 or 6 TVs. We're all going to die from fluorinated water. No one believes that we landed on the moon. I mean, I had an entire list of these things. And it hit me that these things often come from mass media, but many of them are lowbrow. And I can't think of anything that they associated with the United States as being highbrow. And I want to know if you have a reason why that might be.
The hegemonic cultural power that the United States has been the export of its mass media productions, particularly television and film. And those productions that are disseminated widely throughout the world tend to be, as you note, decidedly lowbrow. One thing that you missed in your list, violence. When I was here, wherever I talked, do Americans really carry guns, and do we get shot and shoot that often?
They wanted to know how many guns I owned. And I said none. I said my dad has an arsenal, but I don't have any, and they were amazed.
Because again, the media would make them think that we have a much higher rate of violence than we do. In fact, there has been a drop until recently, I suppose, a drop in the number of violent deaths in the United States. But you wouldn't know that because if it bleeds, it leads. So the media tend to focus upon violence. But part of, like any statistic, part of that is a result of better triage too. People that would have died a decade ago, teasing aside, talking to some of my medical friends, now survive. So a lot of people are still being shot. They're just surviving, so they're no longer murdered. They're just wounded. But that's an interesting comment, and it's absolutely true.
Thanks, Robert. That was a great talk, lots of different talking points as a result. I might add that Norman Rockwell is the favorite painter for George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who are the folks paying $4 to $10 million the canvas. So it's interesting that the purveyors of some of the most middlebrow culture in the United States, if not the globe,
middlebrow culture.
Appreciate, but also have, and they talk repeatedly about how influential Rockwell's been on their films, both in terms of narrative, content, technique. It's really quite fascinating. Which kind of leads to my question, which is, thank you very much for the stuff on Howard Pyle, and I agree, I don't think there's been hardly enough work done in American art history on the popular commercial illustrators. So given what you said about Pyle and pirates and the look, how much do you know about the interplay between Pyle and the early silence? Do you know about any influence that he might have had in the burgeoning American motion picture industry, which had a bunch of choices in terms of how they might unfold, but definitely picked up on that look? And I'm wondering if he ever did any work, if you know anything about him in the movies.
I will say that I have not done that work, so I don't know it, except that you can see the influence. So you can infer an influence, whether the influence is actually there or not. The pirates look like pirates from his books, and of course, his illustrations also accompanied like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island and stuff, but they really didn't dress that way. Knights did not dress that way. Robin Hood did not dress that way. But if you look at Errol Flynn's movies, a little bit later than The Silence, of course, that's Howard Pyle in celluloid. But I'm afraid I can't speak specifically or definitively on any direct connection between Howard Pyle and The Silence.
Well, thank you too, Robert. I have a question. I like the way you sort of related, reception and production in a way, because that's, what gets sort of, kind of complicated when you talk about the middle, the high, and the low. And to me, at least maybe in a more sort of, continental kind of way, it seems that it's the production and, in a sense, the intention of the work that sort of defines that. And in essence, at least in the Anglo-American Academy, this sort of lowbrow, middlebrow culture has a sort of high cultural reception just by the simple fact that it's being taught, and researched at universities in the academia. So I guess there is an irony there. And I'm thinking that something can become middlebrow, which is high cultural in terms of execution, like Sylvie Guillem, She can have she's a famous, French dancer. So, you can have a month of Sylvie Guillem, but 3 nights of Sassavals that we've been discussing with Heinz last night. So there's also another division to me between the sort of, within high culture, between the more experimental, eventually, the reception of which has nothing to do with capital. It's more to do with symbolic capital of the audiences than, financial sort of means. So I was wondering whether, you see that.
Well, absolutely. There is that sanctioned form of high culture that has the resources, financial and otherwise, that's directed toward it, and it's relatively conservative. It usually follows the experimental, and one of the reasons why I think that middlebrow and lowbrow culture are so, there's an economic impulse to make them profitable. It costs a lot of money to make a movie. It costs a lot of money to produce a film. The writers who write for a middlebrow or lowbrow audience are writing primarily, or at least as a large part of the reason to make money, whereas an experimental artist really cares about. So they could be the starving painter, the starving poet, the starving writer, the starving dancer, and it might take a while for high culture to either accept and embrace or to ignore.
Not necessarily starving, but in a sense, having a limited audience. Yeah.
Right, and then limited resources as a result of that.
Thank you, Robert. I think what you said at the end, that middlebrow culture is on the verge of disappearance. Of course, it is intact only when you have a definite definition of high culture. This also is going overboard. And so things are getting blurred. On the other hand, other traditions are rediscovered in a sense. I was just thinking of Richard Powers, for example, the novelist, who once was an experimental or marginal avant-gardist writer who decided to reopen the tradition of Balzac or Dickens in order to be complex but at the same time accessible, so that he would consciously search a middle ground between high and middlebrow culture without being middlebrow. So I think there are always new options in this rather maybe too labeled field of high, middle, low. The exchanges are constantly going on. Pynchon integrated so much low culture or comic film, everything into his very complex novels, that it is difficult to keep these categories so clearly apart.
And you're right, for the purpose of simplicity, this is more of a caricature of the way the society works as opposed. There are many blurred boundaries, and there's a lot of cultural commerce that takes place up and down the presumed scales. Like, as I said, there are rap artists that I've heard that have sampled German romantic classical music. Clearly, they had to have heard it somewhere to know it, and what they do with it shows that they have some kind of an understanding and appreciation of that music. In much the same way that I'm assuming that eventually classical composers will be incorporating new, just as Gershwin incorporated jazz, just as Dvorak incorporated Bohemian and Moravian folk music. So, thank you for your comment. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Robert. I think we should try to keep our attention.
Okay, thanks.